We are now learning that Ukraine has successfully hit an ammunition depot deep inside Russia using 8 long-range U.S. missiles. That is what 2 defense U.S. officials are telling our Oren Lieberman tonight. Russia claims the Ukrainian attack did not cause damage. The U.S. says that is false. But the Ukraine also reportedly used British-made Storm Shadow missiles for the first time today inside Russia as well.
Whoa.
Hear them. Heard them right there in that video. You see the background, but you can hear the explosions. The weapons expert telling CNN those are exactly the types of sounds and blasts you would expect to hear from those Storm Shadow missiles. It comes as Russia is now mass producing nuclear-resistant mobile bomb shelters. The shelters can protect against shockwaves and radiation from a nuclear blast, among other threats. While on Russian state TV, one popular host suggesting that the world is now on the verge of another world war.
As President Putin has repeatedly stressed, missile strikes deep inside Russian territory will change the nature of the conflict, its very essence, and be a radical escalation. After all, the USA, England, and France will be directly entering a war with Russia, with all the ensuing consequences for their own territories.
This comes as a number of American allies are now accusing Russia of sabotaging crucial fiber optic internet cables in the Baltic Sea. The cables connecting Sweden to Lithuania and Germany to Finland were cut on Sunday and Monday. And we are now learning that around the time that this happened, that a Chinese ship sailing from Russia was in that area. Nick Payton-Walsh is out front tonight in Kyiv.
Ukrainian special forces fighting up close and taking prisoners. Rare footage of them still inside Russia's Kursk region, where British Storm Shadow missiles were claimed to have hit Wednesday, these fragments found by locals. Just hours earlier, American-supplied ATACMS missiles also ploughed into Russia, marking a stark new escalation in the war. Yet it was also in Kiev that fear grew, the US Embassy closing here for the first time since the invasion, citing a threat of air attack.
It's a reflection of the heightened tension here felt in the capital Kiev. It's been under regular bombardment for over 2 months, but other European allied embassies are also limiting their function today. Perhaps a sense across NATO here that we're entering a new chapter of this conflict.
As Kiev braced for another sleepless night of sirens, the bereaved planted flags into this sea of loss in central Kiev. Anya's father died of his injuries 3 weeks ago after 5 months in a coma. She is raw from both the talk of peace and fear of sirens.
Так страшно, як сьогодні тут. Я вам скажу чесно, ми сьогодні під кожну тривогу ходили в укриття, бо було дійсно дуже страшно. Не хочеться якось завдавати шкоди нашій країні. Хочеться просто, щоб все було як було раніше, але без російського миру, без всього цього. Тобто
But it's never over in Kiev. The air raids intensifying in the past 2 months, and the weekends seen here the worst for a while. So the heightened anxiety behind several NATO embassies reducing operations this day sparks Ukrainian officials to plead they hold their nerve and deride this piece of Russian misinformation online, a detailed and fake warning of wide-scale attacks. This situation should be interpreted, he says, as Russia's attempt to use any elements of psychological influence. They have one instrument, which is to scare. This has always been a classic element of Russian politics, so I'd like our partners to be more careful as to the information coming from Russia.
What we saw today with that very explicit, specific US embassy closure and warning is a reflection, I think, of the fear of escalation around Ukraine. The misinformation the Russians are blamed for by Ukrainian officials, well, it was a fake, pretty bad fake, frankly. Is that the only thing that caused this US embassy warning? I doubt it, personally, and I think it feeds into a fear here, as I say, of a new chapter. US-made, UK-made missiles being fired by Ukraine into Russia. That's something that Vladimir Putin is probably going to want to respond to, and certainly Kiev is on edge because of that, Erin.
All right, Nick, thank you very much. And I want to go out front now to Evelyn Farkas, the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia and Ukraine, along with the retired Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, former Commanding General of the U.S. Army in Europe. So, Evelyn, these missiles that we heard the storm shadows right in that audio clip, but also now the U.S. ATACMS being used deep inside Russia on that ammo depot, as we understand in the most recent use. How does this tangibly change things? Does it tangibly accomplish anything right now for Ukraine?
Well, I think, Aaron, it puts pressure on the Russian government because the more of these ammunition depots that the Ukrainians can take out, that obviously means that they have less munitions, which means their time is shorter. The other thing is that it disrupts their logistics operations, and that also provides in the short term an advantage to the Ukrainians. So it may not be a deal changer just to take out 1 or 2 ammunition depots, but it's certainly disruptive on the battlefield right now in the short term.
General Hodges, Russia State TV talking about World War III, Putin making comments about nuclear weapons, and now they're sort of mass producing these mobile nuclear resistant bomb shelters, right, that we have video of. What do you see here? What do you think such a thing is about?
Well, I think this is classic Kremlin scaremongering. I mean, I have to give them credit for the new thing of the new bunkers that they'll be selling. The Russians know that Washington and Berlin and London and other capitals react to this, that we're vulnerable to this scaremongering. But if you think about it, why would Russia use a nuclear weapon? I mean, there is no benefit for Russia to use a nuclear weapon, none. Their benefit comes from the way we deter ourselves out of fear that they might use a nuclear weapon. China, India have both told Russia, do not use a nuclear weapon. The United States has said you will suffer catastrophic consequences if you use a nuclear weapon. So there's no benefit on the ground or strategically for Russia. So, of course, you take it serious because they have thousands. They don't care how many people they kill, including their own. But there are only downsides for Russia if they actually do it.
Evelyn, it comes as at least some sort of a pressure campaign appears to be on Europe to turn on this war, if not just simply a more broader escalation or Putin making it clear, that he wants to extend Russian dominance. I mentioned earlier those 2 undersea cables that were mysteriously cut. The German defense minister says that nobody believes they were accidentally severed. And then you had that Chinese ship with apparently a Russian captain, which was, seen in the area around the time that this occurred. What do you think happened?
Well, it seems likely, Aaron, that the Chinese ship did this at the behest of the Russian government. Whether the Chinese government was involved or not, I can't say. But this is a continuation. I just came back from Ukraine just before our elections. In the fall and in the summer, Russia was conducting sabotage operations all over Europe. The German intelligence agency heads were warning that the Russians were conducting these operations, that Russia was getting ready for some sort of operation potentially against NATO allies. So they were raising the sirens. We weren't paying that much attention to it. So the sabotage operations are part of this overall campaign to intimidate.
General Hodges.
Yes.
Oh, about the cables. What do you think that was Putin?
I'm sorry. Yeah, of course. The Russians are at war with us, even if we don't think of ourselves being at war with them in the traditional sense. We used to use this phrase hybrid war, which is really unhelpful and unuseful. The Russians are at war with us, whether it's disinformation, missiles flying through Polish airspace, Latvian airspace, Romanian airspace, sabotage. I'm glad my friend Evelyn used the word sabotage. That's what's going on all over Europe. They're pushing us to find out where our limits are. And so until we finally change our mindset and acknowledge that the Russians are at war, not armed attacks, so not Article 5 stuff, but they are at war. Until we inflict some kind of pain on them, their behavior is never going to change. And so we have to get serious about economic sanctions and helping Ukraine defeat Russia.
And we'll see what happens here, of course, at least what the incoming president has indicated, right, is a negotiated settlement, possible end to all those sanctions, and a complete about-face on all of this. But let's see. All right, thank you both very much. I appreciate it.
Oren, just to Nick's point there, not the only major policy shift that we've seen from the United States, the first being the use of the longer-range missiles now to attack inside Russia, but also now the decision to supply anti-personnel mines to Ukraine as well. And of course, we've seen an increase in funding for munitions and military hardware. I know some part of that was announced in the September surge that the administration announced. Just explain to us what we're seeing and what's new.
So in terms of the package that was just announced with Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin on a trip in the Pacific, that is effectively more of the same, $275 million in military aid to Ukraine. That's not a large number as we've seen before, and there still are billions in aid that the administration needs to get out before January 20th here, so just a couple of months left. The anti-personnel mines, certainly an interesting decision here. The U.S. hadn't provided those in the past. Instead, the U.S. had agreed to provide anti-tank mines and has given those to Ukraine since pretty much the very beginning. But the U.S. effectively looked at the situation and saw that even though Russia wasn't advancing quickly, their attacks with large numbers of forces suffering large casualties was gradually, slowly, and brutally paying off, wearing away at Ukrainian defensive lines. And that's one of the reasons the administration decided to give Ukraine anti-personnel mines, to be able to slow the advance of these Russian forces here. The goal, according to U.S. officials, is that most of these, or rather the intention perhaps, is that most of these will be used in eastern Ukraine, and that's where Ukrainian forces face that brutal Russian assault that they hope to slow down. Ukraine has given assurances, according to U.S. officials, that it will use them only within Ukrainian territory and will be very careful to make sure these don't risk injury to civilians. And that, of course, is the major concern here. That, a couple of years ago, is why the Biden administration said it would no longer create, export, supply, or store anti-personnel mines, with the exception of the Korean Peninsula, because of all of those concerns. But in looking at the situation, in realizing the challenges Ukrainian forces face, the administration has decided to supply those at what is effectively an incredibly late stage of the war, and an even later stage of the Biden administration. And as you pointed out, it comes with that policy change on the use of U.S. long-range missiles. The goal, and I'll just pick up on the last point Nick made here, perhaps to leave Ukraine in as strong a position as possible if President-elect Donald Trump comes in and tries to push for immediate negotiations.
And I think that's the point, Oren. I wonder what discussion is taking place there, if any, of what the Europeans are also doing. There's obviously been these reports that the British-supplied Storm Shadow missiles are now being used by the Ukrainians in Russia as well. And I'll emphasize that's reports. But are you hearing anything about that? And perhaps that the Europeans are also loosening some of the restrictions and ties, along with what they're saying from the US administration, exactly to the point that you're reiterating and that Nick made, that perhaps it's about providing Ukraine with the strongest position they can be in to see what happens with the next administration.
Well, the U.S. has tried to move in lockstep with its NATO allies, so it wouldn't be surprising at all to see the UK allow for the use of Storm Shadows, just as the US allows for the use of the long-range ATACMS. Now, not all NATO countries have shifted in unison on this. Germany continues to say it will not provide its own long-range Taurus missiles to Ukraine. So you see there are disagreements, there is friction here, and we've seen that in the past, for example, with the provision of tanks to Ukraine. So perhaps not too surprising there. In terms of preparing for what this might look like under President-elect Donald Trump, we have already seen the U.S. begin to shift some of that, and to make this, instead of a U.S.-focused effort to assist Ukraine, to make it more of a NATO-focused effort, to effectively create a situation where it can't just fall apart. It will continue, and it has the infrastructure to do so. That has been, over the past several weeks and months, a major effort of the U.S.
Yes, and it remains to be seen how Russia responds to this. Oren, great to have you. Thank you. Oren Lieberman there, and of course Nick Payton-Walsh too in Kyiv.
The U.S. Embassy in Ukraine's capital of Kyiv is temporarily closed and warning Americans there of a potential and significant air attack by Russia. Now, we're also hearing that Ukraine is warning Russia is staging a, quote, psychological attack on the Ukrainian people by spreading fake warnings of a huge looming airstrike. Back with us now is CNN military analyst and retired U.S. Air Force Colonel Cedric Leighton. Take two here. We got started before on this segment. Okay, that was kind of confusing. What what I just described, because part of this is like a psyop. So what is this assessment that Ukraine has? What do you make of this?
So basically what the Ukrainians are saying is a lot of the material that we see on social media and even in intelligence reports is not correct. Now, the Russians have clearly moved some aircraft around. They are doing some of that as part of a psyops game, probably, but the Ukrainians also have to expect that there will be some targeted areas within Ukraine, and they have to get ready for that. They have to get their air defenses ready for those possible attacks.
Yeah, that's been a reality for them. They've seen that lately in earnest on occasion here, right? Okay, let's talk a little bit about this aid that the U.S. is announcing for something kind of controversial, which is not just anti-tank mines, but anti-personnel mines to be used against Russian forces. You had the Secretary of Defense trying to kind of assuage concerns. I don't think they're completely assuaged.
That's probably true, because when you have anti-personnel mines, they are different in characteristics from an anti-tank mine. And what's key here is this little fact right here. 160 countries have banned or signed a treaty that bans the use of these mines. Now, these particular mines, the ones that the U.S. is shipping to Ukraine, are actually battery powered, and they, in essence, have a time delay associated with them. They are only active for a certain period that can be set. It can be set for a couple of weeks, or it can be set for just 4 hours. So that's kind of the difference when it comes to that. But that's all part of a big aid package that the U.S. is shipping to Ukraine.
So the idea is that they basically become like dummies after the battery
That
goes
is correct.
out?
So that will then actually help assuage the concerns of the treaty, and it will also help make it possible for the Ukrainians to move about this area. If they lay mines and then the Russians leave or are forced out of that area, they can possibly use that land once again, as long as they are very careful with how they place these mines.
All right, very good to know. Cedric, thank you so much for taking us through that.
You talk about the test as we move into this new phase of war. When Defense Secretary Austin announced this $275 million in additional support today, he also noted that support to both Ukraine and Israel had really put a strain on the U.S. stockpiles. When you look at that, we look at the budget that Ukraine just passed yesterday, nearly $54 billion, more than a quarter of its GDP is specifically earmarked for defense spending. Yes, there is still international support, but how much concern is there about how long Ukraine can continue to fund this war?
Well, Ukraine can at least for another 5-7 years. I think that's the intelligence or leaked intelligence estimates from Russia itself. Now, that doesn't mean that's not going to be brutal and people will not die. So I think that you are trading off, or we all are trading off, financial support for people's lives. And there was this conversation by Sullivan recently to PBS. He said, our delays of weapons, they don't matter that much. It's more like Ukraine doesn't have men. But I think that's exactly the point, because if there are delays in weapons, we'll lose people. That's a real tragedy. So I think we can go on, but the life toll is going to be enormous.
There is so much being made of what could happen in these next 60 or so days before there is, of course, the inauguration here in the United States, before Donald Trump moves into his second term. He has said he believes, as you know, that he could end this war in one day. President Zelensky just a few days ago says he thinks the war will end sooner under Donald Trump. Do you agree? And if so, why?
I actually agree. I think President Trump will have, 6-8 months in the office in the first 6-8 months to achieve as much as possible in foreign policy, including on Ukraine and Russia. Now, it's not going to be 24 hours because, there is an active fighting going with millions of people on each side's armies. So that's impossible to stop over a day. Plus, Russia will pose the demands which will not be acceptable, not even to Ukraine, but also to Europe, to NATO. So all of that has to be worked out. But it's definitely that a change is coming and an opportunity window will be there.
Timothy Milavanov, it's great to have you here. Really appreciate your perspective. Thank you.
Sirens in the Ukrainian capital of Kyiv this morning as the U.S. temporarily closes its embassy there and warns of a potential and significant area assault by Russia. But Ukrainian officials say not so fast. Actually, they claim that Russia is playing psychological games here, scaring people in Ukraine with fake warnings of a massive attack. Joining us now is Alex Derybakov. He's a Ukrainian father who lives in Bucha. It's a small town in the suburbs of Kyiv, which we've all come to know so well after the Russians invaded it at the beginning of the war and committed mass atrocities there. Alex, first, I just want to talk to you a little bit about this new news and kind of get a civilian's perspective of the U.S. finally granting the ability to Ukrainians to use, the Ukrainian military to use longer range missiles going in to Russia. How are civilians, how are you paying attention to this? How are you seeing this?
Thank you, Brianna. That was a great news. Actually, after all the frustrations that we had recently, that was kind of a light that could show some end of the tunnel. That finally we got it, but in the first place, it shouldn't have been provided. I mean, the ban on using long-range weapons to strike into Russian territory. Now we see the second day. We see how effective they are. We should have had it a long time ago.
And tell us, I mean, a long time ago. This has been going on for so long now. You began this war with a 3-week-old baby, I should mention. You now have another one, an infant, and you are raising children who have only ever really been alive during war. What has this been like for you and your family?
It's been hard, honestly. It's been hard. You have to think about those little kids. You have to think about their future. But how can you do it if the future is so dim? Even now, with the new administration that is coming, it's totally unpredictable. We don't know what they will be doing when they come into office, like in 2 months from now. And this 2 months is going to be a hell, living in this unpredictability. So yeah, we have to think about the kids. We have to raise them, but that's really hard to combine the thoughts of the kids and hearing the news and trying to survive.
What is your worry about what Trump coming into power will mean for American support for the war and for what that will mean for Ukrainians?
The biggest fear is that they would stop support to Ukraine completely. And that would be the dumbest and the stupidest thing to do. Hopefully it will not happen. But this is the feeling of frustration that I can hear in my fellow citizens' eyes. And I can share it, because the signals are so different that we don't know what to expect, really. We will, trust me, we will continue fighting even without any support. The Ukrainians are fearless. Ukrainians, everybody who knows Ukrainians will say, will stay with me. Ukrainians are fearless. We will fight with our fists, with our hands, with our teeth, with our nails, with everything, without any weapons, but we will be evaporated with the time.
And can you talk a little bit about your hope for your kids? They're so little, and I know that it's hard, as you said, to be raising them in war, but you have hopes for their future. What are they?
I hope they will join the civilized society together with their country. By the way, we have decided that we will not leave this country, whatever happens. With the worst possible conditions, we will stay in this country with the kids. And we hope that the country will join the European world and the EU and the NATO, and will be protected against such thugs in the future, such terrorists and aggressors. That is my only hope at the moment, and that's what I tell my kids. And we try to create a positive atmosphere for them, even in such horrible situation.
I am sure that you do, Alex, and they are beautiful. They are beautiful children that you are raising there in Ukraine. Alex Dai Rebikov, thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Brianna.